Hello, my name is Russell J.
Hey, my name is Hisham Kutab, and we decided to choose Levi's and Gap as our two comparative analysis of the two firms for our first case in today's Finance 139 class and Dr. Shiroki's class.
Yeah, both are apparel companies, predominantly jeans companies, both San Francisco based. So Levi's, they have roughly 500 brick and mortar stores, relatively newer on the market when they IPO'd in 2019. However, they were founded all the way back in 1853. They rely on other merchants for sales, but they do have some of their own stores, and their market cap is $9.27 billion.
And similar to Levi's, Gap actually also is a consumer discretionary, and they both own subsidiaries such as Levi's owning Dockers and Old Navy, or Gap owning Old Navy and Banana Republic. Of those stores of Banana Republic, Old Navy, and Gap, they actually have over 3,000 of those brick and mortar stores, which are spread out throughout the entire world, which means that they do have a lot of overhead and lease liability as a set of that, which means that they do have a well-established online and in-person presence. Even though they were just founded in 1969, they went ahead and IPO'd in 1976, so shortly after, and ultimately they have a market cap of $9.706 billion.
So Levi's currently they had, well, in 2019 they had 408 million shares outstanding. Only 6.83% were held by insiders like the CFO and the CEO. 77% of shares are held by institutions, and they have 226 institutional investors.
And on the other side, where Gap is with their shareholders, they actually currently have 378 million shares outstanding. But most intriguing about their current shares outstanding is that 44.15% of them are actually held by insiders, which is significantly higher than Levi's. Also, notably, is that the 525 number of institutions that actually currently hold shares, which are more than double of Levi's, despite them having less outstanding shares.
Cost of capital. So advantages, uh, additional resources to complete projects, higher incentive to succeed as the cost of failure increases along with debt. Taxes as interest expense are tax deductible.
And ultimately, there are, just like Dr. Shiroki says, it is a double-edged sword, which means there are some disadvantages that come along with it. Some of those actually being that a higher risk of bankruptcy if you do fall short, if you don't deliver as well. Also, as a result of taking on more debt and more loans, that often means that you have less control and the flexibility of your actual company. And lastly, as a result of taking on greater debt, that results in a higher beta, which can only discourage current and as well as new stockholders from taking on. Some things to consider when evaluating whether you do want to take on more debt and loan for the cost of capital is definitely looking into the predict the future endeavors of the company and what new projects it's going taking on. Governmental determinations such as tax rates, what sectors you're in, and governmental policies, and of course the operations of the firm, which include the day-to-day responsibilities and operations, the outstanding shares, the accounts payable, the leases they currently have, and as well as many other aspects of the firm.
Firm's costs. So first we took the cost of debt financing. So for the $2.6 billion Levi has in debt, they paid $66.2 million in interest, making that percentage 2.49%. For the cost of equity, we use the capital asset pricing model, which takes into account the risk of the firm using beta, the risk of the market, and the risk of return of risk-free treasury bonds. So using that formula, we found the CAPM to be 5.62. The overall cost of capital, we use the weighted average cost of capital, takes into account how much the firm's capital is financed through debt and how much is financed through equity. We found the WACC of 4.72 for Levi's.
And of course, we kept those and carried them over to keep it consistent for between both firms. And that's how we actually got a result of 0.733, which is much more preferred for the cost of debt for financing that Gap currently takes on, as you can see, as well as the cost of equity was also much more favorable in Gap's favor, as their capital asset pricing model showed that they only had a 4.621%. And lastly, their overall cost of capital, where we use the WACC, and as we all know, a lower WACC is much preferred, and their WACC was nearly half at 2.108% in comparison to Levi's. And in conclusion of all that information, we determined that Gap was the more preferred company in this section.
Current capital structure. So we found Levi's not only pays more interest, but they have a higher percentage of their assets financed through debt at about 63%.
And on the other side, you can see that Gap is actually much more better structured at the current moment, where their equity and liabilities are actually split at about 47, 53%, and roughly around there. And ultimately, they are in a much better condition.
And for this reason, we also chose Gap. So recommendations for capital restructure. We're recommending that Levi's refinance their loans. Liabilities were close to 2/3. High cost of debt. They paid a considerable amount in interest. And they also have a high WACC with a more systematic risk. So we're recommending that they rely less on liabilities and shift to selling additional stocks.
And on the other hand, Gap, although they are in a much better condition, they're not perfect. And ultimately, a way that they can get closer to being perfect through a restructure would be if they reduce their current liabilities accounts payable line, as well as their long term liabilities lease incentives line, as those alone combined together make up for over 50% of their liabilities. By freeing up that much space of their liabilities, this actually allows them to take on more long term debt, which of course wouldn't be unnecessary, as it actually allows them to grow and to invest better into the company, as it could support new projects and new subsidiaries, such as better developing their e-commerce presence. And of course, because all of those are loans, it means that they would beneficiary for them in their current tax rate, as it's non-tax right now.
uh, Valuation of the firms. So for our absolute valuation, we chose to use the dividend discount model. We took future dividends and divided by our required rate of return that we found using the CIPM. Neither Gap nor Levi's had substantial growth in their dividends, so we used a growth rate of 0. We found that Levi's was undervalued by $5.96.
And on the flip side, again, Gap was the more favorable company in this situation, where using the absolute valuation of the DDM was actually, you can find that they were at 4.85 undervalued at the time of when we did the calculations, as well as in the relative perspective, where again, their price to share ratio was at a very minimal of 0.3693. And ultimately, the reasoning behind why we chose these two methods of evaluating are stated within our report. And despite this case being quite challenging, as both Russell and I found, it was also quite beneficiary, as we got to look really into the companies and evaluate different ways that they can grow and fix within the corporation themselves.
Absolutely. So this gives our final recommendation